Hello, thanks to everyone who's tuned in. Today we're having a session titled Integrating cATO with Agile and DevSecOps Practices. My name is Chris Hughes. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Aquia. And today I'm joined by Bryon and Alexis. If you'd each introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah, sure. Hey, I'll go first. My name's Alexis Bonnell. I have the great pleasure of being the CIO and the head of digital capabilities at the Air Force Research Lab, where we get to serve Air Force and Space Force around their technology mission. I also have the wonderful opportunity of being our authorizing official, which means this is a subject very near and dear to my heart. And so, really looking forward to being here and talking about it. Bryon, over to you.
Yeah, so Bryon Kroger, founder and CEO of Rise 8. I spent 10 years active duty Air Force, was one of the co-founders of Kessel Run, and I started Rise 8 to really get after this problem. For me, this topic is near and dear, and my view is that we have to be able to continuously deliver software to our warfighters and other government servants. And the only way that I know to do that is continuous ATO through integrating RMF with Agile and DevSecOps practices. So excited to have the conversation.
Awesome. Well, one of my other jobs today is facilitating this conversation. So let's jump in. So for those of you joining us, I think it's always great to start out a little bit with, why continuous ATO matters, why now, is a little bit of a frame of reference. I think a lot of folks have seen out there, it's been publicly cited that, in places like the Ukraine and others, we have, Russia countering Ukrainian software in 2 weeks. So, and the theme of kind of a constantly adaptive environment, really a game of speed chess now when we talk about kind of the digital realities of national security, especially. I'd love to go and ask both of you why the continuous ATO, why now? What's the advantage and why is this something that's got to be on the table?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I know Bryon has a great perspective on this too that I love hearing. But from my perspective, I've spent a lot of time, in active duty military, a federal civilian, and on the industry side, doing compliance and RMF and ATOs and things like that. And I've seen all these technological trends in terms of cloud and APIs and automation and DevOps and Agile. And throughout that time, like compliance just simply hasn't kept pace. We're still living in Word and PDF and Excel and static documentation, snapshot in time assessments. And as you point out, software nowadays moves in minutes and months, and it's always the long pole in the tent of getting new features and capabilities into the hands of warfighters or federal service members, or new capabilities out to folks that rely on these agencies and services as well. And I think it's a push to kind of push from that that legacy approach to ATO and compliance to a more modernized approach around GRC engineering and making compliance a part of that entire movement around Agile and DevOps.
Yeah, and for me, I mentioned it's near and dear to my heart. My first 7 years, I was an intelligence officer in the Air Force. I did mostly targeting operations, counterterrorism, drone strike in particular. And I saw software cause missions to fail, people to die. We have really great hardware in the Air Force. We put a missile on a fly halfway around the globe. But back in the Joint Operations Center, you look at anybody's computer screens and it's pretty horrifying what people are using to conduct those operations with that advanced hardware sometimes. And I saw a particularly egregious incident where I traced back some issues I saw in software and found out we had known about the issues for a little over 5 years. The requirements had actually gotten funded. The software had been built. The fix was sitting on the shelf waiting to go through the ATO process. So when I showed up at Hanscom Air Force Base and launched Kessel Run with my co-founders, this was like a passion project for me. I was fueled with rage and a little bit of youthful exuberance. I was much younger then. And, we were able to get that first continuous ATO. And I think the name kind of belies what's really going on. As I said before, we have to be able to continuously deliver valuable software that users love. That continuous delivery piece, to do that in federal government, you need an ATO that supports continuous delivery. I call that continuous ATO. I think it's taken on a new meaning, maybe we'll get into, but the only way I know to do that is continuous implementation of RMF. So hopefully the conversation gets there later about how to actually integrate RMF with your software development lifecycle, because I think that's really important. But bottom line, why now? Why does this matter? People die. The cost of delay, in business, when Fortune 500s get disrupted by software, it costs a balance sheet, some P&L statements. But the cost of delay in our industry is lives and really important missions. So we have to get this right.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a lot of times putting on a couple different hats. I think one, in some cases, our most valuable weapons platform is time, right? And this question of how is it that we actually wield time as a weapons platform, right? And to your point, Bryon, and being able to get the things that we have into play, right, into mission, get those minutes on mission is really critical. I will say from an AO perspective, one of the things that has been really frustrating is the fact that people often treat the RMF process or getting to the ATO as the finish line. And it's like, no, no, no. This is the starting line. Like, welcome to the race, right? And there is sometimes a little bit of this behavioral like we're done now. And it's like, oh, no, you have a poem or you have a lot of other things, right? But most importantly, it's really interesting, I think, from a psychology standpoint, right, for us as AOs, because it's often our names, right, are the only thing that exists on this. And yet the question is, well, how do we make sure the things that we put our names to are continue to be shepherded, continuing to be appropriate and can continue to meet the moment. And so, I guess a question I would have is that a lot of times I think also to be generous, sometimes we can maybe make the misperception that people aren't doing the needful because they're lazy or they don't care about cyber or any of that. And I actually don't think that's it. I think a lot of people don't necessarily know what all the options are, right? Might have some misperceptions, might be kind of, told different things, and just are not experts, right, in RMS and cyber. And that's not necessarily something we want everyone to be. So I would say in the spirit of that, what are some of either the misperceptions or the ways that we could actually be generous and actually make this easier on people? Because I believe people really want to do the same thing, but the right thing, but maybe they're not working with the same level of understanding or partnership or options on the table. And I think, the question is, how do we make it as easy as possible, right, to kind of get these behaviors and the continuous awareness and that, that kind of cyber positioning kind of baked in. So help address that from both a people
Yeah.
side, but also a tech side.
Yeah, I'll say from my perspective, I like what you said about, thinking of the ATO as, oh, we're done now. And it's like, software is never done. And security is not a destination, it's a journey. Risk management is a process that's ongoing and iterative, just like software development. So we're here to, be part of that process throughout the life cycle of the SDLC. And, as you point out, we hear like security is everybody's job. And it's like, that sounds good on paper, but like people have other things that they're focused on and other incentives and other priorities and such.
Yeah, and
I've
Chris, and
had,
I'm the only one that goes to jail, right? I'm the only one that goes. It's everyone's job, but only Alexis, right, gets threatened with jail. So sorry, Kate.
Yeah. And I think in my experience, in places I've had, the luxury or pleasure of working that have had successful implementations around continuous ATO or just, better ways of doing RMF, to be honest with you. Like ongoing authorization is a fundamental part of RMF. It's not necessarily new or novel. It's just we're starting to move towards implementing what's already been there and available to us and trying to do it right. Is, abstracting a lot of that away from folks so that they don't need to worry about the underlying controls of the infrastructure and like leaning into things like shared responsibility models and security control inheritance from underlying cloud platforms or platform engineering and platform as a service and so on. Doing things like hardening and landing zones or hardened containers, things of that nature. And then something I know Bryon is really passionate about too is actually meeting people where they are and integrating to their workflow and into the, security is always bolted on, not built in. And it's because of the way we operate, both technically and culturally. We're never kind of part of the team. We come around after the fact with this checklist of things and we're beating people over the head with it. And have you done X? Have you done Y? Tell me how you've done it. And we have to ask them many questions because we're not really part of it. We don't understand what was built or how it was built or why it was built a certain way. So being part of that team and understanding, how things were done and why decisions were made throughout that process can go a long way of alleviating some of that, manual back and forth and churn. And then you can use technologies like cloud native services to automate some of the assessments of, a large swath of the controls, for example, not all of them, of course. But a large portion of them, coupling that with working with people in their, native workflows, empowering them with tools and letting them do the right thing, making the right thing to do the easy thing, as they say, I think can go a long way too. But I'm curious, from Bryan's perspective as well.
Yeah, one of the biggest maybe misconceptions out there is that we need to move away from RMF. Maybe actually I'll step back and say, like, getting to cATO is an exercise in bureaucracy hacking. There's bureaucracy built up around the ATO process, just like there's bureaucracy built up around all sorts of acquisition processes and our whole industry, right? Full of bureaucracy. And the first thing is you can't hack a bureaucracy or any system, I guess, that you don't understand. So the first thing is, folks want to skip the step of really understanding the RMF before they start trying to hack it. And that leads to really hacky solutions in a negative sense. And so I see a lot of that. And I would say for those listening, one of the first things you can do if you're bringing somebody on to help you, either internally or a contractor, have them sit down with your RMF people, like the people that are just super pro RMF or ingrained in RMF. And after they walk away from that conversation, if you go talk to your RMF people, they should be impressed by who you're hiring, which is probably the opposite of what people expect me to say, right? Like you should butt heads with them. And I saw this happen over and over again. And it became very popular, in fact, to get on LinkedIn and criticize all the RMF people and make jokes and post memes about EMAS with like the granny meme looking through her spectacles. But when everybody else is doing what's popular, we just have to remember to do what's required. And that would maybe be the last thing I would say with all bureaucracies is sometimes you don't get the chance to change the bureaucracy until after you've beaten it. And so sometimes you just got to do the work and then ask for policy change or reform. But a lot of people try to ask for that up front. Well, if you did this, then I could do that. And it's like, no, just do the work. Mm-hmm. And now you have data that you can go back with and say, here's what we need to change. And that's the best way to build trust with your AO.
Yeah, and I think that I think trust is such a critical factor. One of the things I've been talking about with my RMF team, and to your point, Bryon, and for those listening, no one likes to be the villain of the story. I want to be really clear. It sucks, right? When whether that's the RMF team or whether that's, for me in the AO position, it's like you automatically know that you're almost like you're the guaranteed villain of the story. And I think it's a really interesting question, to be able to say, well, what would it look like to at least, we may never be the hero, but what does it look like, to at least get closer to, to showing up in that capacity? And I think one of the things that, I love about what you're raising, number one, it just strikes me that the conversation, needs to be participated by like all folks early. And so, our team is looking at what we call kind of security as a service. So instead of being that punch in the face at the very end, of a process and, like thou shalt not pass innovation, right? Until you survive this thing. How is it that we actually show up early? And, to your point, what we found is when our team gets in early, not only can we say, hey, here's some considerations that would make your RMF process way easier. So to Chris's point, like use an approved tool or make sure you turn on your cloud provider's stuff in this way, or, those other elements. But I think it would be, it's really interesting to kind of say, how do you pre-solve some of these things, but even how do you have what do good conversations look like in your teams? Like sometimes, I'll see that like the DevSecOps, the program folks, the RMF, like there's an opportunity early on to have a conversation, and it's really about teamwork. But people, I think if my perception is that they see, to your point, maybe different players in this as barriers or like pre-assign them the villain role. And I wonder for both of you, like, what does it look like when, number one, a team is really healthy functioning, who should be in it in order to really go on a great continuous journey? But two, what does it look like practically to actually assume that RMF person or the ATO process is going to be able to show up as a positive contributor instead of that punch in the face? Like, what have you learned about trying to make that happen proactively?
I'll say, I'll kind of use an example where a contractor is coming in. I know there's like organic software factories. I think those operate a little differently, but being on the contractor side of this now and seeing the interactions, one play. So we have a cATO playbook. It's public, by the way. You can access it on our website. It's like all of our secrets. We just put them out there because I want this to not be an insider's game anymore. The number one play that we recommend is actually fencing off some of your program dollars to send to your AO to hire technical assessors. So first role that I would recommend adding to, it's not a permanent member of a delivery team, usually one technical assessor. If we're talking app teams deploying on like cloud infrastructure, can support 5 to 10 teams, sometimes more, depending on how high performing the organization is. And maintaining that like a good ratio there is really important. Your people say security and ATOs are important to them, but then you just look at their budgets. How much of your budget is going to cybersecurity? How much of it is going to compliance? Lost me for a minute there.
And just to pull on that, like what's the recommendation? Like if I look at a budget, of a program, is it 1%, 2%? I'm sure the answer is it depends, but is there any frame of reference, especially in a digital age, or the idea that things would constantly be changing, that you found as at least a viable consideration benchmark?
Yeah, it depends, right? In industry, they can actually map this out financially, right? So risk management in industry very much looks at like what's the actual risk of or exposure if there was a cybersecurity incident. And sometimes they make deliberate decisions not to fix things because the risk of it occurring and the cost of it occurring is low enough, right? That's how real risk management is done financially. But we don't play in a game of, profit and loss. As I mentioned before, like our cost of delay is live. So mapping out your budget to that, I think, is relatively difficult. And it also depends if you're just building workloads deploying to enterprise architecture, or if you're like a Kessel Run, for instance, that has to manage their own worldwide infrastructure. That comes with a lot more security responsibilities. I'll just take it. I think most programs that I know are in the space right now, in DoD at least, where they're deploying to some enterprise infrastructure, like a Platform One, Cloud One, or similar. And for them, I think that ratio is good. Like I would want one technical assessor. Now that's a pretty high cost FTE. I would say you should plan on like fully burdened cost of close to $500K a year for that person. As you build out the team, you could take on some more junior folks, but I would have that for, I said 5 to 10, but mostly because organizations aren't mature with this yet, we're seeing about 5 teams to 1. So that's what I'd be looking at. So it's actually, and that's just on the assessor side. There's a whole piece on like cybersecurity, building out your like secure release pipelines. The folks that are managing like all of your scanning, pen testing should be done regularly. We recommend a minimum of quarterly. So those costs start to add up pretty quickly. I can't give you a percentage.
Yeah.
It really does depend, but I think that's important.
I was going to jump in there, not to get into like the quantifying of labor rates and burden rates and stuff, but people may hear that and go, wow, that's really expensive. And it's like, well, have you looked at the manual churn and back and forth that occurs between, non-technical assessors who are not familiar with cloud native services and open source and CI/CD pipelines? And have you quantified like that cost? Because it's often pretty substantial. And it's not just financial, it's also cultural too. And that's why we see what we have now, where people dread engaging with the ATO process, dread engaging with the RMF folks and the RMF team. And it's because they're often having to explain things that like, how the hell does this person not know this, right? That kind of thing. And it's like, you need people who are competent in the technologies that you're assessing, because I often say, like, how could you possibly secure and or assess something if you don't understand how it works? Like, you need to understand the technologies that you're assessing and working with to be able to, effectively assess them. And something you talked about too, in terms of secure enablement, I really like is like, it's leaning into, we see pushes from CISA and others around secure by design, secure by default, things like that. And those have significant downstream, cost savings and benefits essentially that you reap later on if you integrate security on from the onset. Otherwise, you get that friction, that that dreadful interaction that many people already are familiar with. And like, and this kind of what gotten us to where we are now. We say, hey, what we're doing and what we have done is not working. We need a new way of doing this. But that said, I think it's we need to make sure we do it right, so that our continuous ATO doesn't just become a way to skip doing the work, as Bryon said. Like, you should be doing the work even more effectively, more competently, and more capably than you did historically by using technologies and new methodologies and things like that as well.
Well, I mean, let's talk about some of those new technologies. I think you both know, I'm obviously a big fan of AI and have really high hopes on where this is going to continue as a technology to contribute to whether that is, our cyber posture or the ability to respond. And quite frankly, even the RMF process. Like I will say if anyone out there has a great AI tool for the specifically making the RMF process better, like I am all ears. Can't wait to hear about it. I don't think I'm the only person out there around this, but also recognizing, AI doesn't solve it, everything. What are some of the, other complementary technologies that either are upon us or that commercial use, or ways that we can reduce the toil, a little bit in this process? And then I would say, how is it that we help people, or how do you help people, be aware of what those are? I think one of the most interesting things I find to think the point both of you were just making is um, a lot of people just we don't make it easy, right? And so there was literally part of me, I was talking with my team about, whether when we give someone a poem, is there some way to say, like, for this, for number 2 on your poem, here is a link to like 30 different services that do this. So either you can figure it out, or by the way, here are 3 options, right, for you if you don't want to figure it out because you have other things you need to do. And so I just wonder, how do we bring those things together, and what are some of the technologies that folks listening in, should have on their radar?
Yeah, I guess I'll start real quick on this one and start with AI and then work backwards. We have seen a lot of excitement around Gen AI and LLMs and the ability to generate, compliance documentation and things that typically have taken a long amount of time and a lot of back and forth, and some innovative capabilities around uploading diagrams and generating system descriptions and things like that, or automating control statement implementations and things like that. I just I share that excitement, but I also say we need to make sure that the things that are being captured actually are tied to the actual system and the context of the system, and they're actually relevant. They're not just helping us fill out stuff faster that's still not accurate or useful or relevant. We just kind of fill out paper faster, basically. And I also, I keep a close eye on this, and I'm very excited about AI's ability around things like vulnerability remediation, identification, prioritization, things like that. Still some ways to go, to be honest, with you, from what I'm seeing, but I think we're seeing good signals that there's some real potential there. There's also, moving beyond the AI side of things, there's also a lot of great capabilities in terms of cloud native services that can help automate, like I said, large portions of the controls, not all the controls, of course, but a lot of them. And then leaning into like hardened base images and things like that can minimize some of the, inherent security technical debt that you're starting to build on as a foundation. And then I've been a big advocate of, truly minimizing the noise around vulnerability management. Typically, especially in DoD and in federal, like I literally have written a book about effective vulnerability management. Not to plug my own book, but it's great content around the topic. Like we historically have prioritized, oh, you got to fix all the highs and criticals, there's 20,000 a year that come out, and of those, less than like 2% are actually ever exploited, ever. And like, so leaning into things like CISA's known exploited vulnerability catalog, or the exploit prediction scoring system. Like, is it actually known to be exploited? Is it likely to be exploited? Can I even reach this in production? Those kind of things can take like, a massive vulnerability backlog and burn it down, 90+%, and let me focus as a developer. Like, what do I need to focus on? What really actually matters? What poses true risk to the organization? That can go a long way, and we've had a lot of success there too, of just helping people kind of cut through the noise and focus on what matters. And then last thing I'll give a plug for is like platforms like CNAP, not CNAP in the DoD context, but cloud native application protection platforms, things like that. That can look at the underlying cloud environment, vulnerabilities, configurations, things of that nature. And I'll pass it to Bryon too.
Well, and Bryon, before you go, I think one thing, Chris, I just want to double down on with what you said is really what you're talking about is that ability to prioritize the difference between just being in the security lane, right? And then like the compliance lane, right? Because, that real intentionality to balance risk. And I think this is something that I can imagine, so many of my colleagues on the DoD or government side, we first and foremost want to be secure, right? The RMF process is intended to give us a way to be intentional about that. But when we treat it just as compliance, we end up a little bit in, some of these overwhelming cycles. And so I think that opportunity to be able to say, well, what's the likelihood? Like, how is it we're actually addressing, the likelihood of risk or security is
Yeah.
really an interesting one.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment, Bryon, and then back to you. Is like, I hate the phrase, I've heard a lot, and I've said this earlier in my career, compliance doesn't equal security. And like, it sounds good and it feels good when you say it because like you're like shouting at the pain of compliance that you're familiar with. But let's ask ourselves objectively and realistically, in the absence of RMF and ATOs, how much effort do you think systems would put into security? I promise you, it's probably less than they already do now. And not only that, but if you add, that contextualization, business, criticality of assets, data sensitivity, exploitability, things that I just talked about, well, you're getting to real security risks that matter for the organization. And that's where compliance can truly be, security basically.
Yeah, I wonder how many people would take a flight if we all got on the flight and I shouted, "Hey, maintenance checklist, don't leave to safe flights. We decided not to do the maintenance checklist today." I don't think that would go over well. As far as technologies, I'll go much more basic because I think the first goal is just what's better than what we're doing today. And the title of this was Agile DevSecOps Practices. Hopefully folks are either already on or moving towards cloud-based infrastructure. But what I want to say about that specifically is one of the huge advantages of moving to that kind of architecture, especially when we get into cloud native platforms, is the modularity that comes with it. And that allows us to reduce batch size. But if we don't then reduce the batch size of our ATOs, all we do is create this big giant bottleneck where we batch up all of our work and deliver it waterfall like we always did. That comes with not only functional problems, right? Waterfall leads to lower capability delivery. It also comes with security problems because one of the biggest vulnerabilities is time. It also becomes very difficult for any one person to wrap their mind around. The assessments are no longer just in time. So I think really focusing there, as basic as it is really important. And then some of the like bespoke tooling that I would recommend. First, you've got to I would say digitize your compliance. Most people are doing that in EMAS today. I do think EMAS has an unfair rap. I don't love it, but like it's not as bad as people say sometimes. I think just the experience that you have with it ends up being bad. But I still would recommend moving to a more modern GRC platform. There are a lot of them out there. I will say, and because the one I'm about to say kind of falls in a hybrid category, but whenever I recommend GRC platforms or SD elements, which I'm about to talk about, usually I get pushback of like how bad people's experiences have been with those as well. It's just worth noting that once you get outside of like core security software that's widely used in the very like modern commercial industries, GRC platforms, like I've looked at almost all of them. The UX is not good. It's not what we've come to expect out of like Silicon Valley style, or even some of your modern scanners have really great user experiences. GRC platforms and associated tooling, UX can be a little rough, but they still save you valuable time. So like SD Elements is a great example of one where we can take the controls difference between the platform and what you need to get an ATO, inject those controls into a team's backlog. And what I really like about what they do is they provide just-in-time training, right? So if I get something like cross-site scripting, comes out of one of my scan reports and I shoot that over to a developer's backlog for mitigation, hopefully they know this, but we know not everybody is secure. Security is everybody's job. Not everybody's trained in security. It's like, what the heck's cross-site scripting? Okay, now I get a training module. It tells me how to implement the mitigation. I implement it, and going back to having a dedicated technical assessor, now I can have a real-time back and forth between me and my technical assessor. Real time is important. That can occur in SD Elements as well. And then they ultimately say, hey, this has been assessed. We accept this. And now you're, reducing that batch size again. Every single implementation is assessed in real time as it comes through. That will help a ton. And then maybe the last thing I'll say is not like something you can go buy off the shelf, although plenty of people try to sell it as if it can, is secure release pipelines. People talk about cATO pipelines. There's no such thing, but there are patterns you can implement into a standard CI/CD pipeline that help with both security and release best practices, which also contributes back to security, I would say. And with that, I would just say you usually are going to need a custom team. You should build it in whatever your teams are already using for CI/CD. But that should be like a 6-person dedicated team, and people going back to technical assessors plus this team, like that's really expensive. But if you're like Cloud One, Platform One, or even like one of the medium-sized software factories, you've got 6 or 7 teams. Instead of funding a dev team, funding a secure release pipeline team, you're like, oh, that's like 1/6 of my capacity. Like I just reduced 1/6 of my feature velocity. Well, not so fast, right? Because now what we've seen is we can get most teams to a weekly delivery cadence. And if they need to, like in emergencies, they can ship daily. Well, what's your feature velocity really? Is it how quickly you can deliver them to staging or production? Because if it's production, I actually probably just 5 to 6x most teams capacity. And if you compare it to waterfall teams, 25x.
Yeah.
So even though I reduced my dev team capacity by 20%, I like 5 to 25x my actual delivery capacity.
Well, and I think that that's a really great way. One of the ways I think about this is, and the teamwork intentionality, or putting these resources, like perceiving these resources as a little bit of like shared fate, right? So you both talked about, like, with cloud providers or with any of these, vendors, or even within the team, understanding that there is an interdependency, right? Like, you can put a great feature out, but if it's not going to get cleared, or if it's going to get caught, in the digestive system of, that process, it's not going to breathe oxygen, right? And so understanding those trade-offs, I think, is a little bit more of a kind of a savvy leadership balance that I'm seeing some folks make, like you highlighted. I think the other thing, Bryon, you kind of inspired me to realize is, if I am going to make kind of the, hey, we need you to do these things, but maybe here's some cheats on how to do it, maybe one of those is also linked to training, right? It might be something where, let's just make it easy for someone to not feel overwhelmed, maybe not feel, silly or stupid. It's hard to keep up with all of this. And so I'm really struck by, if we can start from a place of empathy, right? A place of passion, for our national security mission. These types of things are really interesting. I know at some point soon, I got to bring us to a close. I am interested to throw you guys a little bit of a curveball. Where and how should we think about the kind of continuous ATO opportunity next to something like reciprocity?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one first. First off, I just want to say on the shared fate, and empathy comment, I agree completely. I think I often try to advocate to my security peers, like, we often think security is the center of the universe, and it's unfortunately, like, it's not, right? Like, the software factory exists to deliver capabilities to warfighters or service members or people that rely on the civilian agencies and so on. We need to realize, if we're impeding that to the point that it's having a negative impact on the broader program, like, we're compromising our own part of the program. Like, we're in this as a team, as you say. So we need to remember, like, just like security is there to support the business, it's there to support the mission. We need to remember what the mission is, and if we're impeding that, that's a problem. Like, in security, needs to take a step back and realize that. With regard to reciprocity, this is a concept that has been around for a long time. Again, like, ongoing authorization, reciprocity has fundamentally been around for years. It just never has been implemented well, and it's because, in my opinion, a few factors. One is, it's often a problem in the sense that people are reluctant to trust in security in general. So if you say, hey, we've already done this, you can just inherit what we've done, you get reciprocity, and like, it sounds great, and then you start to take a look and you're like, wait, nothing is like documented, there's no details here, like, this is, I can't trust this. Like, I need to go do my own due diligence now. So I think doing the work, as we said in the beginning, can go a long way of getting people to trust and have reciprocity there. And then facilitating that between programs and platforms, and having modern GRC tooling, like Bryon talked about, that can kind of facilitate showing the work. Show me the controls, implementation statements, what you've done, how you've done it, the residual risk that's been captured in POAMs and things like that. That's what facilitates reciprocity. And that's, really, we're talking about trust between entities, whether it's individuals, AOs, programs. Facilitating that trust is what can facilitate reciprocity, in my opinion. But I'm curious Bryon's perspective too.
Yeah, I think this topic gets caged a lot as like not invented here syndrome. And it's like the problem is on the receivers of the reciprocity packages. But my experience has been most of the problems are in the providers, whether they're common services providers or just like sharing across agencies. And it doesn't take very long to dig into a package and realize, like, not only was the package not done well, but then you start sniffing around the implementation, or some of these organizations have had pen tests done by 3-letter agencies and they did not go well. Once that reputation gets out, like, you're not getting reciprocity. So I'm like, I get frustrated the number of people that complain about reciprocity. I will say we can get there. There's a couple things I would want to see. I mentioned the modular architecture that you can build out with cloud native. We haven't really gotten into some of the tactical details of that, but really strong controls inheritance mapping will help you out a lot. And I think if you pair that concept with modular authorizing, which requires you to draw authorization boundaries differently. I would say NIST doesn't preclude you from doing it, but maybe I try not to criticize the RMF very much. I actually think the documentation is quite good, but this is one area where we could flesh out a little bit more clarity about how you can draw authorization boundaries in the cloud native world that looks more like what AWS does than a traditional stack that we would see in the DoD. And that could be where maybe you have an infrastructure provider, say that's Air Force Cloud One, a platform provider like Platform One, and then the app layer. That's like a really rudimentary way to look at it. I would like to see in the future where people start contributing common services to the platform layer, regardless of whether they're part of a Platform One like organization or not. And then at that point now, those packages can come together in modular ways. Your GRC platform needs to support that. That's a big gap right now. People try to do this in spreadsheets and it'll kill you. But if we can get to that point, then instead of granting an ATO, this is like super underutilized, but there's authority to use. And so if it's being provided as a managed service at the enterprise level, you, Alexis, if you wanted to deploy an R&D capability there from AFRL, you don't have to grant an ATO, you grant an ATU for the underlying infrastructure, and then you would just grant an ATO for the workload because you still are the data owner for that. And then I think there would still be some discomfort between AOs in that world. So that's where we need to actually formalize the shared responsibility matrix as like an ATO signatory document. So it's like Alexis signed this and Danny signed this. And like, here's what each of them is responsible for. Here are the shared responsibilities. And that gets you mentioned at the top of the call, like, I'm the one that could go to jail, right? That helps alleviate some of those problems in a shared responsibility world.
I love that. And I think, it's interesting as a shout out to my fellow AOs. So much of this, so many different groups have community, right? In a way that AOs really haven't always historically. And so you really have had to find, I've got some just really incredible folks I work with. I mean, Bryon, Rich, so many. I just got to, DAF actually pulled the AOs together, and we had, really for the first time I've been in the role, a chance to get together, to talk, right? And to form those types of relationships and trust. And Bryon, to your point, that question of like, well, hey, can we both kind of sign off on this in our same way, right? Or if I'm going to get something and I know it's likely going to hit another AO's desk, especially when we're talking about fast moving technologies, and that it probably should, for example, graduate from my boundary, I'm just trying to, pick up the phone ahead of time and say, hey, this is coming your way. So what can I do now in my moment, to help prepare this team or this POAM so that it's actually in a better position if I know it's going to probably head to you next? Or can we actually both look at it, kind of concurrently and try to assign that? But, to your point, this is all about really people and relationships and kind of the criticality of that. And, so I guess my ask would be, I feel like as a point of therapy, someone needs to get me like the "Have you hugged your AO today" like shirt or something. But similarly, I think we have a real opportunity to show up in a place of empathy and actually assume the good, right? Assume that people want to do the right cyber thing. Assume that people really care about the mission, and that if we show up together in that headspace, as you both highlighted, we have a ton of options. Right. There's a ton of technology. There's a ton of partners. But maybe, let's prioritize kind of the people. Let's make it a little bit more embracive and early. And I think it sounds like we'd have a very different experience. But especially for my DevOps folks out there, Bryon and Chris and the whole communities that we represent, my ask would be, and I'll ask each of you to kind of give your final ask as we wrap up, like, get to really know like your RMF teams, right? Or really invest in people, because at the end of the day, that empathy, those relationships, matter, and they just help us all show up, better. So I know it's a weird touchy feely way to end our our bits and bytes world, but Bryon and Chris, what are some final kind of recommendations or asks that you have, of ourselves, our audience, or each other?
No, I would actually essentially lean into what you said there, but from the security perspective, and this is something I've had success throughout my career, is like, as much as we love is cloud APIs, automation, AI, et cetera, it comes back to like people, trust, communications. relationships, things that you talked about there. So from a security perspective, I often advocate like get to know the development teams. Like as you said, assume good. They're not something they just don't care about security. Like they're incentivized differently. They're focusing on different things. They have different commitments and ways that they're measured in terms of their performance and things like that. Get to know those teams, what they're building, why they're building it, who they're building it for, and why it matters. And you can go much further with that kind of approach than kind of coming around and being the police in the office of no and making yourself, kind of the enemy, as you talked about. So building that relationship with the development teams, engineering teams, and of course, the AO and so on has worked well for me, and I suspect it will work well for other folks as well.
Yeah, my ask is related to kind of what I started with, that cATO has taken on a life of its own, that I don't always love the direction it's gone. And I would say two things. One, I've been on a campaign to try to rename it because it was poorly named. I should have never coined the term the cATO. It should have really stuck with CRMF. But because of that, it's become like this special thing that now DoD CIO has issued guidance on. And I think it's made it more of an insider's game. Whatever people's intent was, like it's become harder to reach. It's causing people more pain. And the whole goal was to make continuous delivery for everybody. And so what I would advocate is just everyone to share this message, because people get trapped as soon as they go down this road of calling it cATO and then having to follow all these steps to get there. This was always just ongoing authorization, which is a part of NIST RMF, always has been. It's a very particular implementation, right? So the frequency is much, much higher than we would have seen in like a VM type of infrastructure. And so we are calling that like ongoing authorization specifically for continuous delivery, ongoing auth for continuous delivery. And what I would like to see is not only people just changing the name and like referring to it differently, but building a community of practice around that, one that we own and doesn't kind of get away from us with a bunch of like BD people trying to sell it to the government and everything that comes along with that. So yeah, contribute back. I know Chris and I, do a lot in the community. There are plenty of others, don't get me wrong, but would love to just collaborate with folks and take those best practices and work them into the playbooks and just like share and learn in public. So that it's not a weird insider's game that everybody's trying to sell with their BD reps.
Well, on that final note, I think the last thing I feel like I heard is a little bit of a note out to the GRLs of like, hey, user experience matters. Come on, like let's upgrade that, right? And in all seriousness, it does, right? Again, if we bring this back to people, there really are some incredible technologies or services or products out there, but when they're hard, right, they're hard, and that there's a level there. So we'll close on that. But thank you both so much. Thanks, Chris, for having us on today and being a part of this. And for those of you out there, again, hug your AO. Think about security in the very beginning, but most importantly, bring people together, share your vision, talk about what you're trying to do, and let us all play our different roles and making that a reality as fast as possible, because national security needs it. So thanks so much, y'all.